And moving on slightly, during World War II, a lot of intelligence decisions involve moral gray areas, right? Like lying, forging, and even sacrificing individuals for a larger goal in general. How do historians make sense of these ethical decisions? And do you think the ends eventually justify the means? Did these spies have the impact that they intended to?
Well, I think as historians, we're obliged to provide multiple perspectives, as well as justifications for those ethical choices. It's the historian's job to explain the choices, not necessarily to judge them in the way you might think. If any judgment's rendered, then it has to be done in the context of the situation and the standards of the time. Historians can indicate what those current standards are, but they have to be sure they explain the events and the ethical decisions based upon what was occurring and not necessarily impose today's standards on those actions. I think there's a tension between what we see as perhaps morally and ethically wrong behavior of spies versus the need for that information in certain settings, right? Certainly in wartime, but that's not the only time that intelligence organizations collect information.
Hmm.
Sometimes historically, that information can be used to give one side an advantage over another in, say, trade negotiations.
Sure.
Um, and so there's all sorts of reasons for the collection of that information. There was I want to say it was Henry Stimson at one point said, "Gentlemen don't read other people's mail," which is a kind of what intelligence organizations do.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's really kind of hard. I guess the question becomes, um, when does something cross a line?
Hmm.
Um, when does when does an agent actually go beyond just collecting information? What constitutes treason? And those are questions I think we'll always wrestle with. And it's hard as I think hard as historians sometimes in telling those stories because we have to, as hard as it is, try to be as unbiased as possible
Yeah.
while providing the facts and drawing some conclusions, but also letting the readers draw conclusions.
Yeah. Also, I know you touched on this earlier, keeping in mind that you have to look at things that are happening in war with a wartime perspective, things that are happening in the 1920s and 1940s with the 1920s and 1940s perspective. Not everything's the same as it is today. So I think that's another really interesting thing to keep in mind as well that historians do that generally people should be aware of.
Well, and one of the things that my students this semester, and we talk about um, whether certain actions are morally and ethically justified.
Hmm.
And I think that as historians, but also as citizens, we have to ask those questions.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And um, in another one of your works, in Spies, Lies, and Citizenship, just in the title itself, you link espionage to questions of natural identity and belonging. How did intelligence work and post-war hunts for Nazi criminals kind of shape these ideas and what it means to be a good citizen?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Thank you.
What what frequently demonstrated what it meant to be a good citizen was if the person in question provided a useful service or crucial information. So, for example, people like Werner von Braun and Arthur Rudolph and Kurt Waldheimer, among other scientists, engineers, and technicians who came to the United States after the war in Europe was over, were viewed as good citizens because they were providing important work in the development of military ordnance. And later they worked on, those three in particular, worked on the development of the Saturn V rocket
Mm,
that put a man on the moon. And so there was an exchange. So on the one hand, these people were exploited, but on the other hand, what they got in exchange for their expertise in many cases was citizenship.
yeah.
But if that sometimes their past would come back to haunt them. So, for instance, there was suspicions about Arthur Rudolph that surfaced, and so he was investigated by a division within the Justice Department called the Office of Special Investigations, and they kind of unearthed some questionable wartime behavior on Rudolph's part, and because he wanted to kind of shut down that investigation, he agreed to give up his citizenship and they sent him back to Germany.
Mm,
But he was involved with developing V2 rockets and building a factory that had forced concentration camp workers on not only building the factory, but also in constructing the V2 rockets. And it was his idea to use them. He denied knowing that some of these prisoners were executed for sabotage when the execution occurred right outside his office window. And so here was somebody who was no longer considered a good citizen.
yeah. The public perception can, and even private perception just within the government itself can change. That's interesting.
Yeah, and there were some who were investigated who were not they didn't become US citizens and they were, if we wanted to give them a label, considered bad citizens.
Hmm.
Uh, People like Joseph Mengele, who was the angel of death, Klaus Barbie, who was the referred to as the butcher of Lyon. They were both investigated by the Office of Special Investigations um, because of what they did in concentration camps, whether it was, ordering mass execution or conducting medical experiments. So they wouldn't have ever passed the good citizen test.
Yeah, that's interesting. And now speaking to today and more modernly,
Mhm.
you've co-directed the Second World War Research Group North America, which really promotes new scholarship. How do you think that our culture of secrecy around wartime intelligence, classified archives, myths, continue to affect what historians can and cannot study today?
Well, it's getting a little bit easier to research in files that were closed.
Hmm.
Um, because we're 80 years since the end of the war. And so things are starting to be released. Um, does that mean everything is released? No. And so sometimes we have to try to get at the facts by going in circuitous ways and trying to find other ways to get the information if we can't get into the archives. When I was doing my research back in the late 90s, there was stuff that I needed that was still classified. It's not all necessarily classified now. Sometimes if it could be remain classified because somebody involved in an operation is still alive. Um, People who donated their papers would have put restrictions on how long those papers needed to be closed and not have public access.
Hmm.
Some of that had to do with whatever agreement they signed with the intelligence agencies. They would have signed secrecy agreements,
Yeah.
which meant that they weren't allowed to talk about for a certain period of time. And it was only if those intelligence agencies allowed it and vetted what they wrote or spoke that they could actually speak about it. And so that creates a challenge to us as historians as we try to figure out what people did during the war and what worked and what didn't work, and why intelligence agencies did what they did, until those materials are released, it's hard to get to a definitive version of events.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you see lessons from World War II intelligence history that applies to today's debates about surveillance, misinformation, and national security in general?
Well, World War II intelligence history is still, a relatively new field, so I'm not sure
Sure.
about lessons, but I believe that um, intelligence organizations engage in surveillance and gather this information, and all that contributes to national security. And the fact that we have this growing field of research, I think, is going to contribute to
Hmm.
that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, it's also interesting to think about the idea that World War II intelligence is pretty recent, even though the war itself feels long ago for especially my generation, seeing that we're so far removed from it. But
Mhm.
as you were talking about classified documents still being released up to today and things still not released yet, it makes sense that it's kind of hard to draw lessons from something that's still happening currently, the research that's still happening.
Yeah, several years ago, I tried to get to um, see Lily's cousin, who was English,
Mm.
her papers. She had donated her papers. She did wartime work. Um, but when she donated her papers to, I want to say it was Cambridge, she put an 80-year restriction on them.
Oh wow, yeah.
And I will say that one of the archivists let me see some of this stuff, and there was nothing classified. So I'm not sure why she put that restriction on it. But so when we're dealing with personal papers, the people who donate something to an archives, they negotiate terms, and they can say that their papers remain closed for a specific period of time.
Yeah, that's interesting. And um on a last question. If you could
Mhm.
highlight one overlooked figure or operation from World War II that deserves way more public attention, who would it be, what would it be, and why?
There's a man named Donald Downs, who worked with the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, during World War II. Um, and his work has been overshadowed by better known operatives, like Virginia Hall, the Limping Lady,
Yeah.
who had several books written about her. Garbo, who was one of the double agents. There's his papers, not his papers, the files related to his work as a double agent are in the archives in England, and they published those case files. And the title of the book is Garbo, the Spy Who Saved D-Day. And I always ask my students, how could he do that all by himself? But but so he's like the one double agent that everybody knows about. Or Alan Dulles, who was with the OSS, stationed in Bern, Switzerland. Later became the first civilian director of the CIA.
Oh
So
wow.
there's lots written about them. Donald Downs has published years ago, when he was still alive, a brief memoir, but that's it. There's nothing else about him. And so I'm kind of curious to know if there was anything exciting, or what his contribution was. Um, there are more and more books coming out all the time. There's a new book out about Josephine Baker's Secret War. I don't know if you know who Josephine Baker was.
I've heard the name, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a new book out. And actually, one of the things that the Second World War Research Group North America does is we host um, new book forums. And what we do is we invite senior scholars, other certain scholars, to read the book and give comments. And then we invite the author to respond to those comments. And then we have a Q&A session. And we do it all virtually because we're scattered all over the place. And we're
Yeah,
going
that's
to be
super cool.
doing a book forum on the book on Josephine Baker in February.
Oh, super. That's super interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's fun to discover something that nobody has paid attention to.
Yeah, it'd be good to see if if any work about Donald Downs comes out anytime soon and see maybe more about the about his life and his history and learn more about what he did. Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so much for being here today and taking time out of your busy evening to do this. I really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate you asking.
Thank you so much.